cold draft nearly blows out the single candle in Hannah Kolvik's hand as she stands before the massive oak staircase. At exactly 4 a.m, absolute silence reigns throughout the vast, sleeping house. But for her, this silence marks the beginning of an endless race for survival. The young woman knows that if she drops the candlestick, or delays even for 5 minutes, her life in this house will be ruined forever. She must light 15 fireplaces before the owners wake up, and she must not make a single sound. What I'm about to reveal is forbidden to discuss in classic novels set in the Victorian era. You're used to seeing beautiful balls, luxurious dresses, and elegant tea parties that create the illusion of a perfect world. However, behind every cup of morning tea lay a system that ruthlessly squeezed every ounce of vitality out of people for the sake of the comfort of a narrow segment of society. This hidden mechanism functioned flawlessly only thanks to the harshest discipline and the complete deprivation of basic human needs. Most people today wouldn't be able to survive even 3 days under such conditions. I will reveal the best-kept secret of the wealthy classes of that era, one for which many would have given their last savings. This information will turn your understanding of the price paid to create comfort in the residences of the British Empire on its head. We're used to complaining about modern work schedules, but the actual schedules of the servants will make you take a fresh look at your own workday. You'll see authentic documents and diaries that have miraculously survived to this day. These records reveal facts that even the most authoritative historians have preferred to keep silent about for many years. Today, we'll follow, step by step, the journey of an ordinary person within the ruthless machinery of Victorian daily life. You'll see how duties were divided from 4 a.m. to midnight, and you'll understand why the right to sleep was considered an unaffordable luxury. We'll examine the health consequences of such a lifestyle and compare them to modern occupational safety standards. In the end, a completely different picture of the era will unfold before you, one stripped of its usual noble veneer. Watch the video to the end, and you'll learn what punishment awaited anyone who dared to close their eyes while on the job on that fateful night. The lives of millions of people were governed by a single book written by a 25-year-old woman. In 1861, Isabella Beeton published her famous work on household management. This thick book instantly became the definitive guide for the entire middle and upper classes of the British Empire. It described in detail exactly how servants were supposed to work to ensure the household ran perfectly. Isabella Beeton established a strict standard that turned living people into silent cogs in a vast machine. The main rule for any employee in a mansion was to remain completely invisible to their employers. Servants were to appear only when necessary and disappear a second before they became a nuisance. Maids moved through narrow, dark corridors, specially designed within the walls to ensure they never crossed paths with the owners of the house. If a servant accidentally encountered a master on the main staircase, they were required to turn toward the wall and stand motionless. Any eye contact or attempt to speak first was considered a gross violation of discipline. Isabella Beeton demanded that housewives manage their households just as a commander manages a military garrison. Every hour of working time was scheduled with frightening precision, leaving no room for personal matters. A deviation from the schedule by even 10 minutes disrupted the entire chain of household processes. For example, hot water had to be delivered to the bedrooms at exactly the appointed minute. If the water grew cold, the master's entire day would begin on a sour note, and the person at fault would receive a stern reprimand. Maintaining such order required constant and strenuous work, with no right to proper rest. On large estates, the staff could number up to 50 people, each of whom performed a specific task. There was a strict hierarchy in which the butler and housekeeper held absolute authority over the junior staff. This internal structure created additional pressure, as the junior maids feared not only their employers, but also their superiors. Constant supervision from above forced people to work to the limits of their physical capabilities. The workday began long before the first rays of sunlight appeared on the streets of London. The wake-up time was strictly set for 5 a.m, and for those who stoked the stoves, an hour earlier. The first hours of work were spent in cold rooms, as heating was reserved only for the reception rooms. Servants had to clean the fireplaces, add coal, and stoke the fires before the family came down for breakfast. At the same time, the sound of ash being swept out was not to disturb the morning sleep of the mansion's owners. Under this system, people had no right to feel tired, weak, or unwell. Illness was viewed as a breach of contract and a sign of extreme disrespect toward employers. If a maid could not get out of bed, she was simply replaced by a new candidate from the long line of applicants. There were no social benefits, health insurance, or paid sick leave in that era. The fear of losing their job forced people to hide their condition and work until they were completely exhausted. The servants' meals were also strictly regulated and often consisted of leftovers from the master's table. Isabella Beeton advised housewives to personally hand out food to the housekeeper to avoid even the slightest overspending. Servants ate in the cellars, often standing or sitting on hard wooden benches. Mealtimes were limited to 15 minutes, after which everyone immediately returned to their duties. A lack of calories and vitamins further exacerbated the effects of chronic fatigue. At the same time, the staff was required to maintain an impeccable appearance and adhere to strict dress codes. Uniforms always had to be perfectly clean, starched, and ironed. Servants had to wash and mend their own clothes late at night, after all their daytime tasks were completed. This meant that precious hours of sleep were spent maintaining their own neat appearance. A disheveled apron or the absence of a bonnet could result in a deduction from their wages. This entire complex structure of daily life was sustained by the constant and systematic deprivation of sleep. Isabella Beeton created a picture-perfect image for the employers, but completely ignored the physiological needs of the workers. I'd love to hear your perspective. What do you think about such strict standards of managing people in the 19th century? Share your thoughts in the comments. How did a typical day begin for a London maid? The story of Hannah Corwick gives us a glimpse behind the closed doors of Victorian kitchens. This woman left behind detailed diaries in which she described her daily labour with incredible precision. Unlike Isabella Beeton, Hannah knew the system not from the comfort of her employer's armchair, but from the cold dampness of the basement. Her entries reveal a completely different scale of human endurance. Hannah Corwick's workday invariably began at exactly 4 a.m., regardless of the London weather or the time of year. The young woman would wake up in the pitch-black darkness of the cold cellar and feel her way toward the coarse cotton dress that served as her uniform. She had to get dressed in a matter of seconds so as not to waste a single precious moment of her morning schedule. Lighting her way with a single candle, she moved cautiously through the narrow corridors of the basement. In those early hours, the vast mansion was enveloped in a deep silence that was strictly forbidden to disturb. The first task for the maid was to stoke the massive Leamington cast-iron stove, which served as the heart of the Victorian kitchen. This required carrying several heavy metal buckets of fuel from the coal cellar. The next step was the meticulous preparation of the formal living rooms and dining room for the homeowner's awakening. Hannah spent hours crawling on her knees across the cold wooden floors, cleaning the huge fireplaces of any remaining embers. To bring a shine to the brass and steel grates, she used a special paste made from black lead and sandpaper. Every movement had to be precise and silent, so as not to wake the people sleeping on the floor above. The heavy smell of polish and the stubborn soot instantly coated her hands with a thick layer of grime. Immediately after the living rooms, the maid moved on to cleaning the stone steps of the front entrance facing the street. Victorian standards required that the porch be whitewashed with a special chalkstone called heartstone before the first passers-by appeared. If a maid fell asleep and missed her wake-up time, the consequences for the entire household were truly catastrophic. The lack of hot water by 7 a.m. meant a complete disruption of the mansion's residents' morning routine. The gentlemen needed copper pitchers of boiling water for shaving, while the ladies used the water to wash their faces before breakfast. A delay in this delivery caused a domino effect, pushing back the timing of the morning meals and departures for business engagements. The entire intricate structure of Victorian daily life depended on this fragile punctuality of the junior staff. As punishment for even the slightest tardiness, Hannah could be deprived of her meagre evening ration or have her weekly wages severely cut. Fines were deducted from her modest annual income, which often amounted to no more than a few pounds sterling. In her personal diaries, the maid described a constant, literally maddening fear of oversleeping. This nervous tension haunted her every night, preventing her from relaxing even during her brief hours of rest. The fear of losing her job and ending up on the street without a letter of recommendation forced her to endure any hardship. To ensure they woke up on time, the servants used the most brutal and primitive methods of physiological self-control. Many young women drank enormous amounts of ice-cold water before going to sleep. This trick forced the body's natural urges to act as a reliable alarm clock long before dawn. Hannah Colvik found her own way to ensure she didn't miss the start of the workday. She often slept right on the hard stone floor next to the kitchen stove, ignoring her room in the attic. This saved precious minutes on the descent down the dark staircases and allowed her to retain a little warmth. However, the constant disruption of her sleep cycles was systematically taking a toll on the young woman's nervous system. Deprived of proper rest, her body was in a state of constant stress and physical exhaustion. In a single morning, a maid would cover a distance quite comparable to climbing to the top of a tall city tower. At the same time, the rules of etiquette required her to keep her breathing perfectly, even when appearing in the master's corridors. Showing fatigue or shortness of breath in front of the owners of the house was considered a gross breach of discipline. The owner's breakfast was a complex ritual requiring perfect table setting and flawless presentation of numerous dishes. The table was covered with starched damask tablecloths, upon which heavy silver cutlery and fine porcelain were arranged symmetrically. The householders leisurely enjoyed fresh pastries, fish delicacies, and hot kidneys. Meanwhile, the junior staff were required to stand at attention along the dining room walls. The contrast between the luxurious abundance of food and the hungry workers reached its peak during these moments. The servants carefully watched their masters' every glance so they could pour hot tea at just the right moment, or silently clear away an empty plate. The tension in these moments was immense, for the slightest slip-up could ruin their employer's morning mood. After breakfast was over, the main cleaning began, which continued without a break until evening. On certain days, the schedule called for a massive laundry session in the huge copper cauldrons in the basement. The maids used heavy wooden stirrers and bulky rollers to wring out the wet sheets. The basement rooms quickly filled with thick steam and the acrid smell of harsh lye soap. This work required coordinated effort and incredible muscular endurance from every participant in the process. The washing was followed by hours of ironing using heavy cast iron irons that were constantly heated on the stove. Hannah was responsible for the dirtiest work, constantly coming into contact with scorching metal, soot, and smoke. She had to gauge the temperature of the irons intuitively to avoid scorching the expensive fabrics of her employer's garments. The young woman's hands were always covered in caked-on grime and minor burns that were impossible to hide. This monotonous and dangerous labor turned healthy young women into old women in just a few years. In her personal journal entries, the maid often mentioned a constant aching in her back and legs. Victorian cleaning tools and methods took no account of the human body's needs. Daily floor scrubbing on all fours and carrying heavy loads rapidly wore down her knee joints and spine. Ignoring these mounting physical warning signs became increasingly difficult with each passing year. Her body gradually accumulated fatigue, progressing to a stage of chronic and irreversible exhaustion. Paradoxically, however, Hannah took pride in her endurance and her ability to meet her quota faster than the other workers. She consciously saw a special purpose in her grueling labor and strove to prove her absolute indispensability. This unique inner mindset helped her psychologically cope with the unbearable conditions of Victorian domestic life. The young woman turned her service into a kind of personal feat, documenting her every move. But even her phenomenally robust body inevitably began to falter under the weight of daily, systematic overload. Hannah's morning trials were merely a prelude to a long and exhausting day. By the time the sun's rays were just beginning to illuminate the streets of London, she had already managed to fulfill her quota of heavy physical labor. The physical strain of those first few hours set a pace that could not be stopped until nightfall. But what happened to the body when the illusion of a brief respite gave way to a new onslaught? Next, we'll examine exactly how the Victorian system of rest methodically destroyed workers' bodies from within. There is data that completely overturns our understanding of that era. Modern people are accustomed to the concept of an 8-hour workday, which allows the body to recover. In the Victorian era, such a concept simply did not exist, and the average workday for domestic servants lasted 17 hours. Doctors of that time began to notice strange changes in the health of young women working in wealthy households. This medical data was ignored for a long time to avoid tarnishing the reputations of respectable families. The main problem was a catastrophic lack of uninterrupted sleep. Modern research shows that an adult needs at least 7 hours of quality rest. Servants, however, slept in fits and starts, managing at best 5 hours in cold and damp quarters. The attics, where the servants' quarters were located, froze in the winter and became as hot as ovens in the summer. Constant drafts and noise from the street prevented them from entering deep sleep. Chronic sleep deprivation led to serious changes in the functioning of the central nervous system. The young women suffered from memory lapses, constant dizziness, and loss of concentration. Hannah Colvick described days when she continued to sweep the fireplace while in a half-asleep state. Her brain would simply shut down for a few seconds, trying to compensate for the critical lack of rest. This led to frequent falls on the stairs and burns from hot surfaces in the kitchen. The lack of proper rest devastated the immune systems of Victorian workers. Their bodies lost the ability to resist even the simplest seasonal colds. The damp basements, where servants spent most of their days, led to chronic coughs and breathing difficulties. Constant temperature fluctuations between the sweltering kitchen and the freezing hallway depleted the body's reserves. Doctors often diagnosed young maids with extreme general exhaustion. Hard physical labor, combined with sleep deprivation, led to early joint wear and tear. The young women constantly carried enormous loads: jugs of water, buckets of coal, and stacks of damp laundry. Crawling on their knees across stone floors every day destroyed their kneecaps, causing chronic lameness. By the age of 30, many of the women looked and moved like very old women. Their backs were permanently hunched from constantly working in an unnatural posture. A diet lacking essential micronutrients only exacerbated the situation. Servants rarely received fresh meat or vegetables. Their diet consisted mainly of bread, cheese, and thin soups. A lack of calcium and vitamins led to tooth loss and brittle bones. Their exhausted bodies could not even digest the meager food they were given. Hannah often mentioned a constant feeling of weakness in her muscles that lasted for weeks. Another hidden threat was the lack of daylight in the servants' workplaces. Basement kitchens and hallways were lit by dim candles or oil lamps. Servants spent months without seeing normal sunlight, leading to a severe vitamin D deficiency. Their eyesight rapidly deteriorated due to the need to sew and clean small items in semi-darkness. Depression became the norm, although such a medical diagnosis was not yet known at the time. The reformer Lord Shaftesbury was one of the first to draw attention to the appalling working conditions in the British Empire. He tried to bring the issue of long working hours in factories and mines to Parliament's attention. However, the problems faced by domestic servants remained outside the lawmakers' purview for a long time. It was believed that working in a clean, well-kept household was in itself a blessing and a safeguard against street poverty. The true cost of this blessing was reflected in lost health and a shortened lifespan. Doctors began publishing reports on the so-called maids' disease. This was a collective term describing a range of symptoms, from exhaustion to joint problems. Statistics showed that hospitalization rates among domestic workers were disproportionately high, but even after receiving medical care, the young women were forced to return immediately to their grueling work. Employers did not pay for recovery periods, leaving sick workers to fend for themselves. This merciless machine ground down people's lives, leaving them no chance of a healthy old age. Compared to modern labor standards, the work schedule of Victorian domestic servants looks like a form of legalized abuse. It is clear that it was absolutely impossible to endure such a pace without psychological consequences. What happened next when this invisible world collided with the world of luxury? Hannah Corwick's life caught the attention of Arthur Manby, a London lawyer and poet who was fascinated by the lives of working women. Their relationship became one of the most unusual social phenomena of Victorian England. Manby asked Hannah to describe her day by day, documenting the minutest details of her grueling labor. Thanks to this partnership, we gained access to the thoughts of a person who lived on the other side of the velvet curtains. Arthur Manby was captivated by Hannah's strength and endurance, yet at the same time horrified by her living conditions. He saw a striking contrast between the clean, well-manicured hands of a lady in the parlor and the blackened palms of a maid. Hannah, however, viewed her calluses as medals for valiant labor and dedication to duty. She refused to wear gloves, believing that real work should leave its mark on the body. This psychological mechanism helped her justify the incredible hardships she endured every day. The Victorian-era house was strictly divided into two completely isolated zones. The reception rooms gleamed with gilded trim, smelled of expensive perfumes and fresh flowers, and created an atmosphere of tranquility. Behind inconspicuous doors lay the servants' quarters, bare brick walls, the smell of dampness, coal, and cheap soap. Crossing this boundary was governed by strict rules of etiquette, and violations were met with severe punishment. A servant had to switch instantly between these two worlds, maintaining a mask of complete submission on their face. The psychological strain of having to constantly suppress their emotions was immense. In the presence of their masters, servants were not allowed to show fatigue, irritation, or joy. Their faces had to remain absolutely calm, and their movements smooth and silent. Any display of individuality was perceived as insolence and a lack of proper upbringing. This enforced emotional paralysis wore people down, no less than scrubbing marble floors. In her diaries, Hannah described moments of profound loneliness amidst a crowd of people. Surrounded by other servants and her employers, she often felt completely isolated. Conversations among the servants while working were strictly forbidden so as not to disturb the silence of the house. Communication was limited to brief orders and acknowledgements of their completion. The lack of normal human connections led to deep emotional crises. Manby asked Hannah to visit him in secret so they could talk as equals. In those moments, she shed the mask of the silent maid and became a living, feeling human being. However, returning to the mansion each time was a severe psychological blow. She had to put on the rigid corset of Victorian rules once again and immerse herself in a world of submission. This contrast between the freedom of conversation and slave labor drove many to the brink of madness. The employers often treated the servants not as people, but as expensive equipment. If a broom broke, it was thrown away. If a servant fell ill, they were fired that very day. Isabella Beeton's system made no provision for emotional attachment or compassion. Servants lived in a constant state of uncertainty, knowing they could find themselves on the street at any moment. The fear of poverty forced them to endure any humiliation at the hands of their employers and senior staff. Any attempts to defend their rights or voice dissatisfaction were quashed immediately. A servant dismissed for insubordination received no letter of recommendation from their former employers. Without this document, finding a new job in a respectable household was absolutely impossible. This rule created a vicious cycle of dependence from which there was no legal escape. People became hostages to a system that fed on their fears and uncertainty about the future. Hannah Corwick's diaries became a silent protest against this inhumane order. By writing down her thoughts at night, by the light of a dying candle, she reclaimed her right to speak. Arthur Manby preserved these writings, allowing future generations to see the true picture of that era. Her story proves that behind the impeccable facade lay the immense psychological tragedy of an entire class. Human dignity was methodically destroyed in order to maintain the illusion of an ideal aristocratic way of life. And yet, the most grueling ordeal awaited the servants not during the day, but after dark. When the masters went out to dinner parties or balls, a new phase of the struggle for survival began for the servants. What happened in the empty corridors of the mansion late at night? For most people, nighttime means a well-deserved rest, but for Victorian servants, it was a continuation of their ordeal. The owners often returned from balls, theatre premieres, or clubs well past midnight. Until their return, the entire household staff was required to remain on full alert. No one was allowed to go to bed until the mansion's owners crossed the threshold and retired to their bedrooms. The butler, footmen, and maids sat in the cold hallways, desperately fighting off sleep. Their bodies, exhausted by 17 hours of physical labor, demanded immediate rest and were literally shutting down. However, closing their eyes meant committing a breach of duty, punishable by immediate dismissal. The servants devised elaborate ways to force themselves to stay awake in the pitch-black darkness. Some pinched their arms until bruises appeared, so that the pain would ward off drowsiness. Others paced barefoot across the stone floor of the cellar, using the cold as a stimulant. If one of the junior servants began to nod off, his senior colleagues would mercilessly wake him with jabs. There was a strict system of collective responsibility. If the masters returned and found the gatekeeper asleep, the entire shift would be punished. This forced the servants to constantly keep an eye on one another, not allowing them to relax for even a second. During this time, the fires in the formal fireplaces had to be kept burning so that the parlor would remain warm. Hannah had to regularly carry heavy buckets of coal from the basement to the upper floors. The movement helped her stay awake, but it drained the last remnants of her physical strength. Often, she would freeze on the stairs, unable to take the next step because her muscles were trembling. The moment when the clatter of the carriage's wheels finally echoed from the street brought incredible relief. When the masters entered the house, the servants instantly lined up in a straight row. They took their coats, top hats, and canes, displaying absolute alertness and readiness to serve. Not a single muscle in the face was allowed to betray the fact that the person was on the verge of fainting. Maids accompanied the ladies to their bedrooms, helping them remove their intricate, multi-layered dresses and tight corsets. This procedure could take about an hour, requiring the utmost care and concentration. Any careless movement caused by fatigue could lead to irreparable consequences. An expensive dress ruined by lacing or a hook torn off in a hurry would result in a huge fine for the maid. Hannah had to carefully comb her mistress's hair, gather her jewelry, and prepare the room for bed. Only after the lady had fallen asleep was the maid permitted to leave the staterooms, but even that did not mean the end of a long workday. After the owners returned, the servants had to clean up the traces of their evening's activities. Dirty dishes from the late supper, empty glasses, and ashes in the fireplaces demanded immediate attention. Isabella Beeton insisted that the next morning begin with a spotlessly clean house. Therefore, the servants washed and cleaned the living rooms late into the night, moving like ghosts by the light of a single candle. Once this work was finished, they could finally go up to their cold attic. By this time, it was often already around 2 a.m. Hannah and her colleagues had only 2 hours left to sleep before the cycle began anew. They spent these few moments simply collapsing onto their hard beds, fully clothed. They simply had no energy left to wash up or mend their torn clothes. Their sleep was heavy, restless, and offered no physical recovery. What happened if a servant did fall asleep on duty while waiting for the masters? The punishment was swift, brutal, and meant to serve as a warning to the other workers in the mansion. The culprit would be woken with a shout, forced to kneel in the hallway until morning, or thrown out onto the street without their belongings. The morning shift began with a public reprimand, after which the person would lose their job and their references. In a world where a line of hungry, unemployed people waited outside the door, there was no mercy for the weary. This cruel practice of nighttime waiting was the quintessence of the Victorian attitude toward the labour of others. One person's comfort was built on the literal destruction of the health of dozens of others. Over time, this injustice became evident even to the most conservative segments of British society. Now you'll learn how the story of Hannah Corwick and her diaries helped break the deadlock of this monstrous system. For many years, Hannah Corwick's diaries remained a private secret, safely hidden in Arthur Manby's archives. However, the very existence of these records became a powerful weapon against Isabella Beeton's system. By the late 19th century, society began to realize the scale of the humanitarian catastrophe unfolding within the walls of wealthy mansions. Change came slowly, but the cogs of the ruthless machine finally began to falter. The first blow to the old order came with the development of factory legislation and the labour movement. Lord Shaftesbury and other reformers succeeded in limiting the workday for women in manufacturing. As a result, many young women preferred the hard but regulated work in factories to the slavery of private households. An acute labour shortage forced employers to reconsider their attitude toward domestic staff. For the first time in a century, servants were able to dictate their terms to employers, at least to some extent. The emergence of new technologies in the second half of the 19th century played a decisive role in freeing domestic servants from the most arduous physical labour. The installation of a centralised water supply system in London's affluent neighbourhoods forever changed the morning routine in large mansions. The availability of faucets on the upper floors spared maids from having to make dozens of trips up and down the stairs, carrying heavy copper pitchers. At the same time, the widespread adoption of gas lighting replaced thousands of wax and oil candles. Staff were no longer required to clean candlesticks, trim wicks, and scrub wax drippings from expensive carpets on a daily basis. The introduction of coal-fired elevators and central heating systems also dealt a serious blow to the traditional hierarchy of domestic labour. There was no longer a need to maintain a staff solely for the purpose of keeping the fires burning in the residence's countless fireplaces. Later, the first mechanical devices began to replace heavy cast iron irons and manual washboards. The time previously spent on the grueling maintenance of basic household tasks was reduced several-fold. This technological advancement made it possible to ease the rigid work schedule somewhat and gave people their first real hours of evening leisure. Along with technological progress, British society's attitude toward domestic servants gradually changed as well. Journalists and writers in the capital began actively publishing scathing articles about the actual living conditions in the basements of London mansions. The press began to cover previously taboo topics of exploitation, forcing the middle class to pay attention to the plight of their own employees. In the pages of popular magazines, it became fashionable to discuss the need to grant servants at least one full day off per month. For the first time, public discourse called into question the fairness of the system established by Isabella Beeton's instructions. Respected doctors began to openly warn of the serious health consequences of chronic sleep deprivation and the persistent unsanitary conditions in staff quarters. The publication of statistics on illness rates among young female workers forced many aristocrats to re-evaluate their household management practices. Landlords became frankly ashamed to admit that they were exhausting their servants to the point of severe fainting spells. Pressure from the medical community led to improvements in the quality of food and the expansion of living quarters in the attics. Homeowners began to realize that a healthy and well-rested worker was far more valuable than an exhausted one. Hannah Corwick lived a remarkably long life, becoming a living witness to the decline of the Victorian era and the collapse of its cruel rules. The defining event of her life was her secret marriage to Arthur Manby, which took place after many years of their unusual relationship. Despite having attained the status of the lawful wife of a wealthy gentleman, the woman categorically refused to change her accustomed way of life. Until the end of her days, she preferred to dress like a simple servant, continuing to wear coarse dresses and work caps. She insisted on doing the heaviest household chores herself, deliberately refusing help from others. Her personality was forever shaped by those harsh years when grueling labor was the only acceptable purpose of human existence. She was never able to fully free herself from the invisible psychological shackles imposed on her by the Victorian system. After Hannah and Arthur passed away, their vast collection of personal diaries and photographs was donated to the Trinity College Library. These detailed daily entries have become a truly invaluable historical record for future researchers of daily life in the British Empire. Reading the yellowed pages, modern historians can reconstruct, hour by hour, an authentic picture of everyday life in the 19th century. The documents recorded the true cost of Victorian comfort, detailing the exact number of hours spent, the sweat shed, and the knees worn down. The Manby archives have opened up a completely closed-off world to historians, one to which no outside observer had ever had access before. The story of a London maid has convincingly proven that behind every silver spoon polished to a dazzling shine lay a personal human drama. Her revelations have forever stripped the British aristocracy of its right to cling to the convenient myth of kind, just, and caring masters. These texts capture the harsh mechanism of exploitation, which operated solely through the constant suppression of others' will. It was the quiet voice of millions of silent witnesses that finally broke through the barriers of time and convention. The truth about this hidden side of life forced society to permanently re-evaluate the romanticized image of the gallant 19th century. Modern labor laws are, in many ways, a direct historical response to the appalling conditions of that bygone era. Today, the 8-hour workday, the right to statutory days off, and paid annual leave seem to us to be an absolutely natural norm. Legislative protection against unjustified dismissal and occupational safety requirements shield every employee from the employer's arbitrary power. However, each of these basic rights was paid for with the ruined health and lives of entire generations of workers during the Victorian era. Trade unions and labor movements built these standards literally on the ruins of shattered human lives. When we compare our comfortable, familiar way of life with the merciless schedule of a maid, we begin to clearly understand the scale of historical change. Humanity has made a tremendous social leap forward by recognizing the value of personal time and the sanctity of physical health. Exhausting labor finally ceased to be a form of legalized slavery and transformed into an equal, contractual partnership. People learned to respect others' boundaries, balancing professional responsibilities with the right to a fulfilling personal life. This historic transformation was made possible only by acknowledging the mistakes of the past and rejecting a system of total subjugation. The architecture of old Victorian mansions still carefully preserves the cold traces of this hidden, virtually invisible life. Narrow corridors walled up within thick walls and hidden freight elevators serve as reminders of the strict rules governing the isolation of staff. Steep, dark staircases without railings and tiny rooms with low ceilings in the attics served as the only refuge for these shadow people. These utilitarian spaces were designed not for comfortable rest, but exclusively for performing mechanical domestic functions. The geometry of London's buildings has forever cemented social inequality, embedding it in the brickwork of their foundations. Today, these historic interiors host expensive tours, immersing visitors in the atmosphere of the empire's former grandeur. Guides delight in telling tourists romantic stories of glittering balls, noble lords, and refined ladies. However, the true memory of these walls holds entirely different stories, devoid of elegance and festive glamour. The real ghosts of London's majestic mansions are the weary maids falling asleep right on the stone floors with a stiff brush in their hands. Understanding this harsh truth forces us to view the cultural heritage of one of the most famous historical eras in a completely different light. The history of Victorian domestic servants clearly shows the incredible price paid to lay the foundation for modern society and its labor standards. We no longer turn a blind eye to other people's working conditions, recognizing the importance of mutual respect and human dignity. How do you assess this immense historical journey from complete powerlessness to modern legislation? Write in the comments what other hidden aspects of past eras you'd like to see in our next videos. Be sure to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss new in-depth historical investigations. Hannah Colvick's story is one of incredible human resilience and quiet heroism. She didn't lead uprisings, deliver fiery speeches, or demand political rights. Her resistance lay in the fact that she survived, kept her sanity, and recorded the truth about her life. Thanks to people like her, the system was unable to hide its crimes behind a beautiful facade forever. Their silent work became the foundation upon which our modern understanding of human rights was built. The era of Isabella Beeton and her ruthless instructions is gone forever. We no longer demand that people remain invisible, nor do we punish them for their natural need for sleep. Could a modern person endure even a week at such a pace? Next, we'll summarize this incredible journey into the past and answer the main question. We have traced Hannah Colvick's journey from the cold darkness of the early morning to the grueling night shifts in empty hallways. Her story vividly illustrates the ultimate outcome of the Victorian system, the physical exhaustion of an entire class for the sake of the illusion of an ideal way of life. However, it was precisely thanks to the diaries of people like her that the truth about the hidden cost of luxury compelled society to change labor laws forever. From a silent maid, Hannah became a key historical witness whose legacy outlived the British Empire itself. Let us know in the comments which other hidden historical eras you'd like us to explore in future videos, and be sure to subscribe to our channel.